In the next 25 minutes, what I'd like to try and do is capture you a story about how change agents made an IT transformation happen. It was a place that had more than 207 different IT systems for only 1,750 people. That's one system for every 9 people. I sometimes said I felt like Oprah Winfrey. Look under your chair, congratulations, everyone's going home with an IT system tonight. The average age of those 207 systems was more than 10 years old. And they were eating up more than 85% of our IT budget and growing just to maintain them. 2 years later, there were no systems on premise. They'd all been moved either to the cloud or a commercial service provider, and our O&M spend had dropped from being 85% to being less than 50%. So I'd like to share you how that happens and give you principles to think about how you can apply this to your own organizations as well. Before I jump into that, however, I want to ask the question, who knows what that's a photo of? Anybody? Surely we've had some people that have served in the military, maybe. It's a flak jacket. And the reason why I want to show you a flak jacket is if you're going to create change, if you're going to be a leader, you're going to incur friction. How many of us, raise your hand if you've ever had the interesting privilege of being told, I want you to be innovative, but make sure you don't disrupt anything. That's probably our lot in life as CIOs. And so I want to herald that because if you're going to be innovative, if you are going to be disruptive, someone's not going to like it. Someone's going to want you to get back in your box. And so you have to be able to brave that friction and put on that flak jacket so that you can be shot at but not get killed, and then also extend it to your team. Because if they see you actually extending the flak jacket to them as well, they'll help be your force multipliers for how you create change. Now, we often confuse the difference between leadership and management. Management is when you do what's expected of you, whether it's expected by your boss, your peers, or your reports. In my case, whether it's expected by the Congress, the administration, or the public. But leadership is when you intentionally step outside of expectations. In fact, it's worth noting that the root of the word leadership comes from the Greek word leet, which means to send unto death. And that's because back in ancient Greece, the leets were the ones that carried a flag in front of the melee army. And that's all well and good until one melee army meets another melee army, and who's the first to die? The leets. Nelson Mandela said his most trying moment was when he actually had to turn to his own party, the African National Congress, and said, we're going to make peace with the white minority. He almost had a coup because that's not what they wanted to do. Isaac Rabin, an Israeli, when he turned to his own fellow Israeli citizens and said, we're going to make peace with the Palestinians, unfortunately was assassinated by a fellow Israelis. Leaders are often done in by their own support base when they step too far outside of expectations and don't have a strategy for managing that friction. What I want to try and give you today is strategies for managing that friction, your digital flak jacket, so you can survive. It's also worth noting, and I come from public service, and I know public service sometimes gets an interesting reputation, but I want to say that both expertise and experience come from the same word, which means out of danger. And that's because the only way you get expertise is you do dangerous things, you do experiments. Silicon Valley and some parts of the private sector, not all, have gotten this in recognizing they need to have multiple experiments where they can pivot quickly and learn. There is no textbook for where we're going. But I would submit to you for public service, how many of us want the Department of Defense to try and do an experiment and say that didn't work out, we need another $100 billion, please? We don't have a venture capital fund for public service, yet we also need to learn and learn quickly and experiment. And it's worth noting that supposedly when the Constitution was signed, Ben Franklin was rumored to have said, I can rest easy knowing that the great American experiment will exist for the next 50 years. That was 240 years ago. We may be due for some experiments for how we do public service going forward. Now, as mentioned, I arrived at the FCC back in late 2013. It's always a good sign when there's 9 COs in 8 years prior to your arrival. That sounds like things are going to be sunny. Plus, as mentioned, we were spending more than 85% of our budget just to maintain the existing systems we had, all on premise, 207 different systems, average age more than 10 years old. We literally had 2 Sun E25Ks weighing 1 ton each in the basement. But 2 years later, nothing's on premise. Everything's either been moved to cloud platforms or commercial service providers, and more importantly, without any additional budget increase, we reduced our spend from being 85% to being less than 50% just to maintain those systems. Now, how do we do that? Well, first and foremost, I came out and I said, the most important thing that a CIO should be pushing for is not efficiency. That's not to say that efficiency is not important, but I think that's our legacy from the 1990s. We need to step outside of expectations and say the most important thing that a CIO does is agility to the enterprise. We need to be able to have the organization move quickly. The reason why we had 207 different systems at the Federal Communications Commission is whenever the Congress or the administration asked us to do something new, the response was simple. We'll stand up a new IT system. But if you do that for 15 years, now you've gotten to a place where you can no longer sustain what you've invested in. So we needed to actually move to cloud platforms because that would give us the agility to remix and reuse different commercial services and not stand up future IT systems by themselves in the future. Second, again, we were only 1,750 people. My background included national security and bioterrorism preparedness, and I was very much concerned that an agency of only 1,750 people could not stand up to nation-state threats. Even if I took my entire IT team of 400 people and made them all IT security people, which would probably not be good for the rest of the enterprise, that would not be enough. And so after spending about 6 months trying to talk to the Department of Defense to host us, when that didn't work out because they're .mil and we're .gov, we decided to move to the cloud and to public cloud specifically as quickly as possible because large public cloud providers have many more IT security professionals than I could ever possibly have at my own organization. So we wanted resiliency. And we wanted to have that honest conversation with the leadership that said, if you want complete IT security, unplug yourself from the internet, make sure no human being touches it, and bury it underground. And then maybe you have a chance. But otherwise, if you're going to operate on the internet, you need to think more about resiliency, rapid detection of something going wrong, rapid containment of it, and maybe it's a hardware issue, maybe it's a software issue, or maybe it is someone trying to exploit something, but clean it up, move on, and minimize the dwell time versus the belief that you could ever have 100% IT security. And then finally, yes, we do need to have efficiency. But by stepping outside of expectations and saying the number one thing we're trying to get you is agility followed by resiliency, that actually created more of a call to the 18 different bureaus and offices to make the push. Now, this is the photos of it literally happening as the servers are being decommissioned. And I just show this because it really was a team effort. Over Labor Day weekend, those things that we had not moved, we literally unplugged and decommissioned. Now, in some cases, we had to take some of our existing hardware, the hardware that was 3 years or younger, because we had not gotten additional funds from the Congress. And so we literally sent those to a commercial service provider that is now hosting it for us. In a perfect world, we would have bought new systems, we would have married them, but that would have required additional money that we just simply didn't have. We had to do that with our existing budget. This is, of course, as a team as it happened. And now I'm going to give you 3 principles about how you can apply this same approach to your own organization. Before I jump into it, though, I want to create the compelling sense of urgency why being a CIO and why such dramatic transformation is necessary. If you take all the IP addresses associated with Internet Protocol version 4, which we ran out of numbers about 8 months ago, and if you take those 4.3 billion addresses and put it in a beach ball, how big comparatively is Internet Protocol version 6? It's 1 to the 28th in terms of addresses, but what's comparable to size between IP version 4 and IP version 6? Any guesses? It is correct. We are going from the beach ball to the sun, and we're going to do that over the next 5 years. The internet you've known is that beach ball. The internet you will know with the Internet of Things and everything is going to be that sun. Even a startup today, in 5 years, will have legacy. Think about that for a moment. Even a startup today, any technology they invest in, the latest and the greatest, ahead of the curve, 5 years from now, will be legacy. We're going to have to think about how we do continuous improvement, and we don't allow ourselves to get in this sunk cost situation where we invest in hardware or software, and we don't upgrade it for another 5 years, and then we're surprised when the organization cannot be fast. The organization cannot be resilient. Again, at the FCC, I literally had systems that were 19 years old. So I herald that because thinking about how we move into this environment of exponential change, and what actually the CIA called back in December of 2000, they predicted in 2000 that 2015 was going to be an era in which the ability to exploit and explore information flows with agility was going to be key to success in this era, and that they were going to be turbulent environments. And that the reason why this was happening was because there was increased velocity, increased volume, increased volatility, and concerns about the veracity of transactions on the internet. The interesting thing is while the internet has made us much more transparent, it's also made it a lot harder to figure out what's exactly real and what's not real as a result. So, first thing I want to herald to you is that diversity trumps ability. When I arrived at the FCC, the average person had been there for 15 and a half years. The average contractor had been there for 19 years. The contractors had been there longer than the government people, but in general, on average, they had been there 15 years and developed a relationship with each other. And here I am, a CIO showing up where there had been 9 CIOs in 8 years prior to my arrival, trying to convince them to make change. Who are they going to trust? Their friends from 15 years that say, stick with the legacy contractors on site. We've been with you for the last 15 years. We'll be with you for the next 15 years again. Or this new guy who's had, several predecessors with an average tenure of 9 months. And so I had to embrace the change agents where they were at and say, I need you to be creative problem solvers. And that I herald that because if you think about it, there's actually been demonstrated research. The National Academy of Science showed in 2002 that if you take an expert group and you take an expert and a naive group, the expert plus the naive group will beat the experts. And that's because when you become an expert, you actually get blinders put on. Frank Lloyd Wright was an amazing architect. He is an awful engineer. His buildings are now falling apart. It would have been much better to actually pair Frank Lloyd Wright as an architect with a great engineer, and you would have had a much better product, even though they were different types of expertise. IQs is just one way of measuring expertise, but it's actually a limiting one, because there may be other tools that you need for your organization. And so by embracing the entire team, including people whose expertise were mainframes, as well as new people who came in with cloud services, that diversity helped us trump where we needed to go. Now, a diverse team has more tools to apply, but I also want to herald that this is where your role as a leader is key, because diversity only works if you share the same goals. If you have different goals, you're going to have fragmentation. And so one of the things I did that was very intentional in the first 6 months was I paid for my own coffee, paid for my own breakfast snacks, and between the hours of 10 and 12 every week said, stop by if you want to have a conversation about where you think we should go. And that was open to both the IT and the non-IT people, and it was really trying to listen to them so that when I actually put forward my goals, it wasn't too dramatic from things they were already saying. In fact, they could see their narratives already in the goals I was trying to put forward. That way we had shared goals, and then the diversity could kick in and be an advantage, as opposed to trying to fight about what our goals were. Now, the second thing I actually want to share to you is the power of the edge. So, back in September 11th, 2001, I was with a program called the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program. And on September 11th, 2001, at 9 o'clock in the morning, I was supposed to brief the CIA and the FBI as to what we would do if a bioterrorism event happened. 8:34, the world changed. We literally piled computers into cars, set up an underground bunker, and dealt with the response to both New York and DC with the tragic events of 9/11. Didn't sleep a lot for 3 weeks, stood down on October 1st. October 3rd, we briefed the CIA as to what we would do if a bioterrorism event happened. And 24 hours later, the first case of anthrax shows up in Florida. What I saw during the months of 2001 and later in 2002 and 2003 with severe acute respiratory syndrome and other outbreaks was that top-down fails in the midst of rapidly changing environments. You have to empower the edge. In fact, back in March of 2001, I was a bit of a heretic at the CDC because the Agile Manifesto had just come out in March of 2001, and I was pushing for Agile. And I was being told, get back in your box. That's not part of the 5-year enterprise architecture plan. That's not part of Waterfall that we do. You'll have to wait. And I said, I don't have a deal with the bioterrorists not to strike until we get our enterprise systems online. We need to have at least a minimal viable product. But I show that because if you don't empower the edge, you may miss the changes in the environment. In fact, top-down is really good about being efficient because you can actually have consistency across the views. You can share that view. But what if that view at the top is no longer up to date with what's actually happening at the edge. And so when I arrived at the FCC, recognizing that we had 18 different bureaus and offices, each with their own different subcultures, what I did was I created what I called entrepreneurs on the inside, and embedded them within the FCC, in the different bureaus and offices, and gave them autonomy. They had the ability to solve problems on their own. They could actually help the bureaus and offices up to a certain dollar threshold, and beyond that, they would then elevate it to one of the deputy CIOs. If needed, then they would elevate it to me. But it was really about empowering the edge to get the job they needed done, and my job was much more about the vision and the boundary conditions. And that's how we were able to move with speed. In fact, that leads to the third thing, which is thinking about how you work horizontally. We've already seen the power of an ecosystem and what it can do with mobile, that when you can actually remix across different apps. But we need to also think about the same thing for teams, that no one team is an island. You have to work horizontally across teams that you may not even directly control. That may be teams with finance, that may be teams with HR, it may be teams with the mission. In fact, I try to put forward and say there are no IT projects. There are business or organizational projects. We're just a part of that team, that ecosystem. And the reason why an ecosystem approach is both risky and so powerful is you don't have direct control over some of those components. You motivate people the same way you motivate ants. You don't tell ants where to go, but if you put sugar in certain places, they'll generally go there. If you put certain chemicals in other areas, they'll try to avoid it. But it's much more influence, indirect nudging, as opposed to direct control. And so one of the things that I tried to do at the FCC is I said, if anyone has a really good idea, IT, non-IT, I don't care, come to me and give me 3 reasons why we should do it, but even more importantly, give me 3 reasons why we should not. Oftentimes people forget that why we shouldn't do something. And if they've thought through the 3 reasons why we shouldn't do it, then the last thing I'll ask them is, how are we going to mitigate those 3 reasons why we should not do that? So to put this in case, we had a 15-year-old consumer help desk. It was on-prem, and we went to the private sector to get the gold standard for what it would take to update it. Private sector said it would probably take about 18 months and probably cost about $3.2 million to do it on-premise. Well, we didn't have $3.2 million, we didn't have 18 months. So I put this out as I'm looking for interesting solutions to this. And one of our change agents came in and said, we can do it by going to software as a service. And he gave me the reasons. He said it would be much faster, it'd be 1/6 the price, we could get it done in 6 months. And I said, okay, so why shouldn't we do it? And he said, well, first and foremost, the bureaus are going to resist it because they're used to that 15-year-old system. It literally had 18 different forms. You had to guess which was the right form to download. Once you guessed what the right form was, you had to fill it out and either fax it or scan it back to the FCC. Wasn't great, but that's what they were used to. And then equally, the reason why I went like is their data's not on site, and there may be security concerns. So I said, okay, how are we going to mitigate that? And so we worked through it, and we decided that the best way would be we would engage the stakeholders in the public directly who wanted a much faster system. They didn't want to guess what 18 different forms were. And so we could actually do it much like TurboTax. We're actually answering about 5 questions. Believe it or not, you've answered and filled out a form. You just didn't even know it. It was all behind the scenes and transparent to you. And then how would we address the security concerns? Well, it turned out this software as a service platform had already been accredited in Europe. It hadn't been accredited by the United States. But that's where I, as CIO, was willing to take the risk. And then finally, how we would get over the hump of the bureaus and offices being used to having things on site. I told the change agent to move as quickly as he could to show a prototype. Meanwhile, I would take the flak and the hits. And once you get to a prototype, it's no longer abstract. They see it, and it's easier to get over that hill. We released it. Again, we got it done in less than 6 months. In fact, the coding was only really 60 days because it was already software as a service. The other 4 months was really just helping the process change with the different individuals in the programmatic element for what had changed. Less than 6 months as opposed to 18 months. It was only $450,000, including contractor time, as opposed to $3.2 million. And then about 6 months later, there was an article in Forbes that said how the FCC saved that individual $1,800 because they had gone to the site, had logged a complaint against a provider, and in less than 3 days had gotten a resolution. Those sort of efforts in which you ask for people, much like an internal venture capitalist, you ask for insights from your entrepreneurs on the inside, are ways you can actually move forward as an ecosystem approach. Anybody know who this is a photo of? This is a photo of a young Ensign Nimitz back in 1904. Ensign Nimitz was with the US Navy. he ran his boat aground, the Decatur, in the Philippines, and was court-martialed, but not drummed out of the Navy. Instead, he was assigned to submarines, and 35 years later became one of only 2 5-star admirals we ever had in the history of the US Navy. Now, I share that because think about what would have happened nowadays. Maybe not an instant, but maybe lieutenant commander with the US Navy runs their boat aground in the Philippines. How long on Twitter and Facebook would it have been fire Nimitz? How many news pundits, how many comedians would have been second-guessing and saying, how could he have possibly done this? And what's worse is actually apparently the US naval regs are, if you run your boat aground once, you're automatically out. So he would be fired. And maybe his boss and his boss's boss as well. And so we would have lost a future 5-star admiral as a result of someone making a mistake early in their career and learning from it. And so I raise that because I want to ask the question, not just for public sector, but also for the private sector, which is, are we discouraging people from taking risk? Are we discouraging people from making mistakes and learning from it? And as a result, are we, the public, selecting for individuals who haven't had those moments when they finally get to senior positions? And this is, I think, the role that we need to do as CIOs, is we need to actually first go forward and say, we want our entire team to don flak jackets. And similarly, our conversation with the CEOs or the heads of our organizations is, we're going to do the same thing. Because it's more risky to maintain the status quo, particularly in that exponential era of change, where we're going from the size of the beach ball to the size of the sun in less than 5 years, where we're going from 14 million network devices on the face of the planet in 2015 to anywhere between 50 and 200 million by 2022. By the time we get to 2022, the estimates are there's going to be 96 zettabytes of data on the face of the planet. That's 9.6 billion terabytes of data. To give you a sense of scale, the Library of Congress is only 10 terabytes. So we're talking about 9.6 billion libraries of Congress. Google search will no longer work. The way we index things will no longer work. It's going to drown organizations, both private and public, with so much data that things will happen that had you actually been able to link together A, B, and C in your organization, you could have either avoided a bad thing or seized a new opportunity. But you're going to be drowning in data. And so we CIOs have to don that flak jacket, and we have to encourage our teams to do the same. One closing thought, and then I'll be open to questions. This is a photo of our planet taken in 2013 by Cassini. NASA's probe Cassini passed by Saturn, and I think the photo in 2013 is interesting because 2013 was the year that there was the same number of network devices on the face of the planet as there were humans, 7 billion. Now, again, 2022 estimates are there's going to be about 8 billion human beings. Fortunately, we're not growing exponentially, but upwards of 50 billion or more network devices. So, Carl Sagan said in 1994, look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. Our world's facing exponential change. We as CIOs need to embrace change agents both with ourselves and with our teams. Thank you very much. I'm now open to questions.